let's see. I'm an ecologist, and I was studying seed dispersal by animals. And I was in this little research valley over the hill from Tahoe, where I did a lot of work. It was very nice, by the way. And there's all sorts of animals running around. There's Douglas squirrels, great tree squirrels. There are a couple different kinds of chipmunks. Some, let's see, deer mice, things like that. Okay. And what happens is a lot of these animals eat seeds from the trees. Okay, so in a big year, there's lots of seeds and there are lots of animals. They reproduce very quickly, and all is good. And the plants rely on the animals to actually take the seeds. They're going to eat a lot of them, but they're going to also make them into small caches and regeneration. So anyway, I was up there, and then all about the time of, I guess, July, early July, things were going fine. And then all of a sudden, all the animals started to die. You'd find them by the side of the road, just laying there, either dead or half dead. So we were thinking, oh, well, this is interesting. Now, it turns out occasionally you hear about an outbreak of bubonic plague in Tahoe, just over the hill. So that's what this was. We got a bunch of animals and we shipped them over to public health, and it was identified. So bubonic plague is still around, just so you know. Nowadays it can be easily treated with an antibiotic, but it has to be done very quickly because it's a fulminating virulent disease that will pretty much do you in a couple of days. So if you think, oh, I'm just feeling sick, and then, and you say, well, okay, well, let's make an appointment for the doctor in 3 days. Well, you're dead by then. Okay, so it turns out that anybody in here not heard of, well, the Black Death. This was bubonic plague. It was, no one's quite sure where it came from. Actually, the first plague recorded in this area was the Justinian plague, about the 6th or 17th century AD. And then it showed up later in the 14th century. And this is the one that killed about, they don't know. It pretty much turned Europe on its head. Now, if you remember, okay, so, and they still don't know whether it was, sometimes it turns into pneumonic plague, where you can actually catch it through the air instead of getting it from fleas, because it's normally a vector-borne disease. So you have the rodents and the fleas bite other rodents and transmit it. Same thing with humans. Okay. It's not the rodent's fault, by the way. Okay. Anyway, they don't know how many people it killed. They don't know how many people were there. But it probably killed at least a quarter, but I would say probably a half, maybe more. Some villages were entirely wiped out, just like Ebola, just like the last Ebola outbreak in West Africa. Just completely wiped out. No one survived. Now, it was a feudal system. Anybody know what a feudal system is?
Hierarchy
Mm-hmm.
from kings to knights to peasants.
Okay, so in a feudal system, works great if you have lots and lots of peasants, because that's the labor. And you don't have to pay them anything, you just have to let them keep enough to keep themselves alive, right? So feudal systems can go on, but this changed everything. So many people died that suddenly workers were in high demand. And in fact, shortly thereafter, we start seeing something change in Europe, which was the Renaissance, because the whole feudal system broke down. In other words, you can see that pathogens and diseases like this can have really, really far-reaching consequences. Like I think in the beginning of the class, I said who's living and who's not, and a lot of people, back in this day, they would have, oh, you're all gone. A lot of people died. Well, they didn't live very long, and they were actually lucky for not living very long because life was short, and Hobbes and brutish and whatever. It was miserable. And people, if they managed to get out of childhood for one thing, that was a big deal. But, they might live until they're in their 20s or something. So, this is a painting, I think it's either Bruegel or Bosch. Kind of looking at, if you actually go into this a little bit, you can see bodies all over the place. It's miserable, okay? Now, as I mentioned, there were 3 plagues. There's a Justinian plague, which was the red. Now, it looks like everything, it's like saying, the French pox, that's syphilis, right? That's what the English called it. The French called it the English pox. Obviously it didn't start here, it started somewhere else, those evil aliens that brought it in. So, but it does look like the center of the plague was actually in China. In fact, they actually found kind of the precursor to the plague, and it actually had some genes missing that made it much more easily transmitted. So in the past, it wasn't transmitted very easily. Very few people got it, but suddenly there was a genetic change, and the bacteria could actually survive inside, let's say, an insect vector, in this case, fleas, that it couldn't before, and it was able to be transmitted much more easily. Okay? This is kind of an old phylogeny. Now, in the 14th through the 17th century, really it was the 14th when most things happened. There was this strain that you can actually see where it is. Okay, so this is the big one, and if you actually go up here is where the strain actually shows up. Okay. Now, the one that killed most of the people, the biggest amount of death was in the 14th century, and then every probably, 30 or 50 years, it would cycle back through because people who survived it actually had some immunity left over, so they really couldn't get it and carry it. But after they died, there's a new generation that didn't have immunity, and it started again. In fact, this is the one where, in the 17th century, Isaac Newton went to the country and escaped like everybody else. If you want to read a great description of it, a first-person description, read Samuel Pepys' diary. It's the most famous diary. It's from 17th century London, from about 1660 for the next 12 years. I think his eyes got too bad, but he wrote about it. The whole royal family decamped and went somewhere else. And during that spring and summer, London had about 150,000 people then, or 100,000. Well, there's about 10,000 people or 6,000 people a week that were dying. I mean, it was just extraordinary, just like we saw over with Ebola. So a pandemic, like the Spanish flu, which was a pandemic, yeah.
If the black fever originated in China, why did it do as much damage?
It probably did. We just don't have the records. So that's what it looks like. In fact, you know that, let's see. Okay, so, and in fact, so here's the Spanish flu. Again, well, maybe it started in Spain. It was a swine flu. Most flus are from birds, but they're able to jump from one host to another. It's called zoonotic disease, moving from one animal host to another. And it killed about 50 million people, but not anything like the Black Death. By 1918, there were 2 billion people on the planet, so it was a lot of people. I mean, I talked to my grandma who lived through it, and she said, you know, people, young people would just, they'd feel sick in the morning, and they'd be dead the next day. And they actually sequenced this. They went up to a village up in the Arctic, an Inuit village, where most of the people died. There's a graveyard where they all got buried together. And they actually recovered the virus, and they sequenced it, and they looked at the changes that actually led to it being more virulent. Because instead of just being a really bad respiratory disease, and it also infected a lot of other organs as well, kidneys and stuff. So you had kind of massive organ shutdown at a certain point. So anyway, that's why. So it carried different alleles that made it much more likely to cause problems. And there's been, you know, bird flus that have seemed to, they always arise. They're circulating all the time. Most of them stay within birds. Some of them are quite bad, but they don't transmit very well to humans. The big fear, of course, is that they will be transmitted to humans, and that you might have another, let's say, Spanish flu happening again. And it'd probably be worse in terms of the number of people, because it's a lot easier to get around than since 1918. But of course, there's better medicine, so some places worse than others. So a pathogen is a disease-carrying organism. It can be a virus. It can be a bacteria. It can be an archaea. That's those other single-celled, non-nucleated organisms. It can be a fungus. Okay? And it's a disease-carrying organism. Whether it can be transmitted or not, we'll see, depends. Now, when it does find a host, we call it an infection. When it can be transmitted from one organism to another, it's said to be contagious. But mind you, there are organisms, or there are diseases, like the plague. They're not transmitted necessarily from one person to the other. There's a vector in between, in other words, an insect. And so I would say insects, or malaria is another example. A lot of tick-borne fevers, or ticks carry a number of different diseases that are really pretty cool. And how contagious they are really depends on the characteristics. Okay, so like anthrax, there was remember just after 9/11, someone put some anthrax out there. They weaponized it. It's not terribly contagious. However, it is, if it gets into a person's lungs, well, first of all, they're probably going to die. Okay? Normally, you get what's called a superficial infection on the skin. It's treated with antibiotics. It's not a big deal. The spores for anthrax will remain in the soil forever. That's why it's a big disease among sheep. They get something called scrapie, I think. No, that's something different. Okay. When it gets in the lungs, then it can be contagious. In other words, from one person to the next. So contagious can be inhalation, like the flu. It can be contact. In other words, contact with another person. Another person's bodily fluids, like Ebola. Ebola is actually not all that contagious. You have to be really protected in terms of if you get any on your skin, there's a fairly good chance you're going to get it, but it's not like getting it through the air. It doesn't do that. Okay? STDs. Bodily fluids, right? Including, sharing needles, but mostly having sex. Like syphilis or gonorrhea or all kinds of different things. HIV, right? HIV is an STD. You can't get it from mosquitoes, by the way. Okay. Okay. So, non-contagious pathogens spread by means other than, let's say, person to person. We'll get to T. gondii in a second. Salmonella, well, I would say it is contagious. I don't like their description of contagious here. Salmonella, you get really sick. You throw up everywhere, diarrhea. Waterborne diseases, foodborne diseases are highly infectious. Once they get on the surface, you can easily pick them up. You're caring for someone who has that. And so, in a sense, or if you were to kiss someone with salmonella, it'd be contagious. Okay? So it's not quite like, let's say, anthrax. And then, of course, you can, as I mentioned, there's a vector-borne disease. Transmission through an intermediate host. Here's the tick. As I mentioned, one of them is Lyme disease. Another is called tularemia. There's a bunch of them. In fact, they're discovering new ones all the time. They show up, people showing up. They can't quite figure out what it is. They don't exactly, aren't able to identify the organism. And then finally, they actually do identify it, and it's a new organism. They haven't seen it in people before. Okay. Now, pathogenic means how easily they are actually transmitted. Some things are easily transmitted. Anybody in here have ever had measles? Okay. Anybody, German measles? How about whooping cough? Okay. Y'all had, I'm sure you had vaccines, right? That's a good thing. Anybody who tells you that vaccines are bad for you, I guess they are. Look at me. I mean, oh my God, I could have been something else. Okay. It turns out a trait, like I have 5 fingers, right? Or a trait. I get hungry and I go to the McDonald's. Behavior, right? Okay. Well, disease organisms have traits. One of the traits that they have is the transmission, how it's transmitted. Some people it's not transmitted, like we said. It's really not all that contagious. Others they are. Now, I won't say this, that inhalation diseases tend not to be that virulent, where they transmit, well, they might transmit easily, but they don't cause a really, really bad disease. Mainly because, if you think about transmission, let's say you get something, and it just puts you on the ground. Well, if an organism is kind of relying on direct transmission, and you're lying on the ground and not walking around spreading it, it's not going to get very far. And so those kinds of diseases, let's say it was pneumonic plague, they tend to burn out quickly. Okay? But most diseases that you get from inhalation, like the flu, they're not all that bad in the general part. If you actually look at this, okay, so on the bottom here, we have deaths per infection. 0.1 degrees, 1%, 10%, whatever. And actually, if you actually look at up here, these are diseases that are transmitted fairly easily. Okay? They're not necessarily as virulent as some other ones, but with a vector-borne disease, you can be lying on your back, completely incapacitated with malaria. This is great. Malaria relies on a mosquito. If you're unconscious in a delusional fever, are you really going to go and slap it and worry about another mosquito biting you? No. You're just flat out. It's a good meal, okay? It even turns out that the malarial parasite manipulates the mosquito to bite someone who's already been infected with malaria. Okay? Those people emit certain chemicals, and the mosquito picks up on it, but the malaria actually infects the mosquito's brain to do this. And we'll learn more about a lot of parasites and pathogens. They take over our brains. It's really cool. So vector-borne diseases oftentimes tend to be extremely virulent. Vector-borne diseases. And that's because you don't have to travel around. You can be completely wiped out, and if something bites you, it can still be carried. Let's see. It turns out also that waterborne and foodborne diseases tend to be easily transmitted as well. And most of them survive well, not in the body but outside. And good example is, let's say, cholera. There's still cholera outbreaks. You can die from it, certainly, usually from dehydration. In the past, it would kill, thousands and thousands of people. In Naples Bay, sometimes it infects shellfish. And so it's a great spot for cholera. And so then they eat shellfish and everybody gets it. So you have to be careful. But that doesn't stop me from eating shellfish, by the way. Okay, so waterborne diseases tend to spread fairly easily too. Okay, so I mentioned the different kinds of pathogens. Also, these are bacterial, viruses, and then our big eukaryotes. In other words, cells that have a nucleus. Okay. There's all kinds of eukaryotic pathogens. Some are single-celled. Some are multicellular, like worms. Leishmaniasis, river blindness. A whole bunch of them in Africa that are really cool. They have interesting life cycles. Giardia is something that we can get. You can get fungi, cause all kinds of pathogens. You can get something called thrush. It only usually shows up in people with compromised immune systems. So a lot of AIDS patients, before there was any kind of treatment, would get, one of the things they get was thrush. And they'd also get something called toxoplasmosis. Okay, so protists, these are single-cell eukaryotic pathogens. Amoebic dysentery, sleeping sickness, malaria, all sorts of different things. So this is a plasmodium. We talked a little bit about this already in terms of people who are fairly resistant to it because, well, why are some people resistant to it? Do you remember?
Sickle cell anemia.
Yeah, exactly. In other words, someone who's a carrier is actually the cell is, let's say, kind of sickle cell shaped, and the carrier can't actually get into it very well. Okay? So it's protective. Of course, if you have two copies of the allele, then you have sickle cell anemia, and your chances of procreating long or living long enough are pretty slim. So in other words, you have to have such a high incidence of malaria that it actually overcomes that deficit in terms of all those homozygote recessives. Bacteria, Yersinia pestis, that black plague, Lyme disease, is like a spirochete, anthrax, syphilis, all kinds, gram-negative, rods, cocci, whatever it is, viruses, flu, common cold, HIV, Ebola, lots of them. Okay. Viruses, some people say they're not actually alive because they don't have their own metabolism. They hijack the metabolism of a cell by invading it and getting their genome incorporated into the cell's genome and produce more viral particles. But I think they're wrong. Viruses evolve just like anything else. They've even found some viruses that are these megaviruses. I think they infect like amoeba in the ocean or things like that, that actually do appear to have some, so like in a halfway between a virus and some other pathogen. Prions, well, they're kind of crazy. It's actually misfolded protein that if you gets in contact with other protein will make it misfold and cause a disease like mad cow disease. It was first discovered by this guy named Gondrzek. He won a Nobel Prize. He was working with the North Four people in New Guinea, and they were cannibals. They weren't the kind of cannibals necessarily where they go out and hunt someone from another tribe to get their power. They were actually cannibals where their own dead, they eat their own dead. It was part of their ritual. And people who ate like anything that wasn't brain tissue was fine. But mostly the women and children ate the brain tissue, and usually within a couple of years they'd start coming down with a neurological disease where they lost control of everything. Okay, you can see old pictures of these people. and they didn't know what was causing it. Well, there wasn't like a virus or anything. There was this prion disease that they would get infectiously by eating the brains. That would infect them. So remember a few years ago there was this mad cow disease, very much like that. Prions are kind of, well, you can read up on them. They're very strange sorts of, so in other words, they don't actually, they're not hereditary. Okay, spirochetes, cocci, a lot of bacteria, of course, have what we call flagella. Now, we might think bacteria, viruses, all that kind of stuff is terrible. I mean, they're out to get us. They are. But it turns out that there are more bacteria in your gut than there are human cells in you, by a long shot. In other words, you could almost think of it that the bacteria are using us to get around and reproduce. We're doing we're getting food for them, we're giving them a nice place to live, right? What are they doing for us? Well, some of them actually do produce some vitamins for us. And it turns out that when a baby is born, first of all, its gut is not well developed. Its immune system is a proto-immune system at that stage. As they get more and more gut bacteria, that actually affects the way their gut takes up food. So you can actually do it where you wipe out all the gut bacteria, let's say in a mouse, and you can give them food, but they don't gain weight. You might think, well, that's great. Let's get rid of my gut bacteria. I can lose all this weight. Not so much. But they play a very, very, very important role. But they play a very important role not in just, as it turns out, digestion. It turns out that they play a huge role in immunity and the development of our immune system. We thought, well, gut bacteria, it's all part of digestion, right? No big deal. We got to have them. They do a great job for us in digesting things. There's things that we can't digest that they can, but that we can then absorb the nutrients, right? But it turns out that an immune system that we're going to talk about has to be developed. Now, I told you early on that individuals are acted on by selection, only populations evolve. Well, it turns out that we have an adaptive immune system that evolves. And that's a good thing, because our bodies can get infected with something, or we can get a vaccine that lets our bodies know that they should recognize this as a pathogen and that they can knock it out quickly. So if we didn't have an adaptive immune system, recognizing new pathogens or new antigens, then we would have a problem with anything new that came along. Okay, now, it turns out right here, see right here, where I just shut, no I didn't. Right here, I've got a very specific kind of bacteria right here. I do, probably a couple of them. I've got another one right here. Other bacteria, they're not the same as these. No, they're different. They don't live in the same place. Got some in my ear, in my nose. I'm covered in bacteria. You probably don't want to touch me. They don't cause a problem at all. In fact, a lot of the skin bacteria, that's part of our first line of defense. They keep bad bacteria that might be landing on us from taking hold. They outcompete those bacteria. You can also use bacteria for all sorts of different things, including making food, like cheese and yogurt and kefir and all sorts of things. So obviously pathogenic, bacteria that produce pathogenic diseases. A lot of times, the symptoms that we see are the result of toxins. So typhoid fever is a waterborne and foodborne disease. Pretty serious. It turns out that they release these toxins that are the things that really make you sick. In fact, they have neurological effects too. You can see people who are completely delusional with typhoid fever. Other ones that you probably heard about, like tetanus, the bad effects are caused by a toxin. Botulism causes huge deaths in birds for the most part, some people. But the botulinum toxin is used now all the time. It's used in plastic surgery, and so to get rid of the wrinkles, you just do a little, injections here and there and there, and it kind of makes all the little lines go away that make you have a distinctive face. And so now you're nice and perfect. And you can use it on other parts of your body as well. So I haven't had it done yet. Maybe I should. So a lot of the symptoms that we see with certain things are because of toxins they release. There's a video, let's see. Okay, where did I put it? Here. So, population growth. You already did that little thing on population growth. Usually, population growth, like bacteria, they'll start out slowly, and then they'll grow like this. So this is called exponential population growth. So you have one bacteria, it buds into 2, 2 into 4, 4 into 8, 8 into 16, 32, 128, until you have millions of bacteria in a short period of time. The only thing, of course, that's stopping them is resources, food. Okay? So bacteria, their life cycle, they can reproduce much more quickly than us. Okay? We produce what? Not even once a year, really, when it comes right down to it at the most. And usually only successfully a few times in your lifetime. Oh yeah, you can look at it later. Now, let's see. Now, eukaryotic cells actually don't have a cell wall. We do. No, I mean we don't. Eukaryotes. Bacteria do. They have an extra membrane around here that is actually the cell wall. Now, this is a flagella. These little hair-like things are cilia. And then also, the proteins on the cell wall are oftentimes the targets of antibiotics. In other words, they work in breaking down the cell wall. That's why you get resistance to antibiotics, because you have a mutation and the cell wall becomes resistant to that sort of antibiotic. So in other words, exposure to lots of different, to an antibiotic being used all the time, just by chance alone, you're going to get some variants that are somewhat resistant to the antibiotic. That's why they want you to keep taking the antibiotic for the full course, let's say 7 days, instead of saying, oh, I feel better now. Okay? Because let's say you have an antibiotic bacteria that has a mutation. It's not completely resistant, but it's a little bit. And if it doesn't quite get nailed, it reproduces and has offspring that are somewhat antibiotic resistant. And of course, some of those might have mutations. Most of the mutations won't do it any good, but that make a few more antibiotic resistant, and so it builds up over time. Same thing with pesticides. Okay? So when you use antibiotics, you're actually creating an environment, a new environment for the pathogen to exist in. And if it can find a way, it's not thinking, it's not nothing like that. If a mutation comes along that makes it able to survive and reproduce better, that's how you get antibiotic resistance spreading. Just like, oh, tumor evolution, yes. Everything evolves. I just told you. Okay, viruses. They're either made of DNA or RNA. If they're DNA viruses, of course, they're two-stranded. RNA, there's a single strand. They can't do anything on their own. They're actually the perfect, what I would call the perfect parasite. Why carry around a kitchen with you when you can go into someone else's kitchen and use it just as well? In fact, your kitchen might suck, but this other kitchen you go into is beautiful. It's got industrial gas ranges, ovens, pans. This is beautiful. You can make a much better meal, whereas the other one, you know, maybe mac and cheese or something. Okay, viruses, that's what they do. There's receptor proteins on our cells. They use those to actually get into the cells because they've got receptor proteins on their outer coat. They glom onto it. All the DNA unwinds. And then it is copied then and inserted into the cell's DNA that then goes and starts making new copies of the DNA or RNA of the virus and the protein coat. And makes it go on and on and on and on. Now, some viruses, when they do that, they then make the cell explode. They lyse it, and all these particles go spewing out. In other words, in other cases, the viruses are made, they bud off. The cell is still working, but it's also a virus factory. And viruses can do something else, too. They can hang out in our genomes for years. Who in here had chicken pox? Okay. You still have chicken pox.
And I had shingles.
Do you?
Yeah.
I had it too. Sucks. Anyway, chicken pox. It's a virus. It's inserted itself into our DNA. It actually has now traveled up into some nerve cells that it's hung out in for ages and ages. And then sometimes, as adults, something causes it to decide to go for a walk. And it does. And suddenly you break out in these, blisters, but it's more than that. Underlying, it's like there's neuralgia. So it's very, very, very it can be really painful. Usually it's thought because our immune systems as we get older don't work so well. Shingles, especially immunocompromised people, show this. But it's not all that terrible, but anyway, don't worry about it yet. You will. Anyway.
There's a vaccine.
What? Oh, that's right. What am I talking about? Acyclovir, right? It's
I don't know,
yeah.
everyone should get it, because it is awful.
Yeah, I forgot about that. So there's antivirals now. I'm still back in the ages of only antibiotics. So there's antivirals like, for AIDS and stuff, and also for Ebola now they're working on them. But there's one for this where you can get a vaccine, and it'll kind of keep everything at bay. So your immune system is kind of what it does is it makes it hypervigilant. All kinds of viruses. Plant viruses, bacteriophage, that's a virus that actually infects a bacteria. I've already told you about how it happens. They hijack the host. The viral particles come out, unwind. What they do is actually they get transcripts that are then able to insert themselves into the host DNA. Okay, there's viruses, of course, they can attack all sorts of different tissue. Flu and cold viruses, mucous membranes, measles virus. It turns out measles virus is probably the most contagious virus out there. If there was someone with measles that walked into this room, and there were people who were not vaccinated against it, there'd be a 90% chance that you would get it, even if they came in for a second and then left. Okay? Very, very, very transmissible. Rabies and polioviruses, of course, neurons, all kinds of different things. HIV attacks our immune system cells. So here's bacteria. Now, these are all bacteria around here. They're bacteriophages. They have an immune system too. They've evolved enzymes that can cut up foreign DNA and RNA. Okay, remember that another cause of cancer can be viruses. HIV is actually, there's an analog to it that actually causes a kind of a blood cancer. It was first found in Japan. I think it's called, I forget what it is, but it's closely related to the AIDS virus. And then there's something called HPV that is responsible for genital warts and cervical cancer and throat cancer, things like that. Now, it turns out that there's a there's a vaccine for it. It's developed a number of years ago. And we say, well, start giving this to your daughters, your sons too, it turns out, obviously, and get them vaccinated, because cervical cancer, well, it's a slow-growing cancer, but it still can kill. It kills lots of people. Okay, so if you're protected from this, is great. Of course, how do you get genital warts? Anybody? Sex? So, there's some people who feel like they'd rather have their daughters and sons get cancer than actually get a vaccine, because they don't want them to have sex, as if that's possible. Well, I shouldn't say that, you know. Some people might have those ideas. But anyway, this is a good thing. Protects people. Stops them from, because, you know, genital warts are no big deal, but cancer is. Already talked about this. Talked a bit about this. HIV, of course, it infects the immune system cells, like the helper T cells, the white blood cells, and the B cells. And what it does is it actually destroys the immune system. And the disease itself, this HIV, doesn't kill us. When our immune system is destroyed, then we get all these opportunistic infections that would normally be from pathogens that are not pathogens. They don't cause a problem at all with us because our immune system keeps them in check. So usually people die of pneumocystis carinii, thrush, toxoplasmosis, kinds of cancer, all sorts of different things. It's kind of an insidious virus in that way. Of course, it can only be transmitted through exchange of bodily fluids. So RNA, HIV is an RNA virus. That means there's a single strand. We're made of DNA, 2 strands, right? Now, 2 strands, DNA is more stable when it comes to copying and mutation, because you've always got the other strand to make sure that things are copied correctly, a template to base it on. But RNA genomes don't have that. There's a single strand. Now, because of that, they have high mutation rates. I want you to know, most mutations, as I mentioned in the past, either have no effect or they're bad for the organism. They are involved in production of a protein, and you have one amino acid substitution instead of another, it doesn't work as well. But lots of mutations, the more you have, the more likely it is that eventually one of them is going to be favorable, in this case, to the AIDS virus. So what you do is when you see someone who, let's say, initially gets infected with the AIDS virus, and you eventually they start showing, you know, low, they get tested, let's say, and you sequence the viral genome of the AIDS virus they got. Say, okay, this is what it looks like. This is, and it's probably got from this subgroup that's been circulating in this area. Okay. Well, because there's so many different mutations that come up, AIDS in a patient tends to evolve. Not only does it evolve, but you have different strains in different organ systems. So the strain that's actually in your white blood cells are different than the strain that often you find in cells in the spleen and cells in the brain. Okay, so what you do is a lot of times you'll end up with a whole bunch of different strains circulating in a person. In fact, that's why initially the antiviral, there was just one called AZT, AIDS developed resistance very quickly to it. Now they have a 3-drug cocktail, and each one of those drugs works on a different aspect of attacking the AIDS system, the AIDS virus. It uses a special enzyme called reverse transcriptase, where it takes the RNA and it uses reverse transcriptase to turn it into a DNA strand. Oh, sorry, reverse, yeah, no, that, anyway, that's what it does, but it has a much higher error rate. Okay, I kind of went over that. This is what they do now with AIDS. Treatable. Immunity. There were some people who were infected with HIV. Nothing happened to them. Nothing. Much like people with sickle cell trait, they had a mutation in the CCR5 stretch of proteins on the protein coat of the lymphocytes. And it made people so that the virus could not invade them. In fact, it's very much like, now I know that bubonic plague is bacterium, but it's actually very similar to the same protein that it infects people with. And so here's one guy. Well, I know what they did. Oh, they actually cured him. But there are people that are born, they have a mutation that makes them not susceptible. So you can imagine over time, if AIDS was something that really swept through the population, killed people quickly, you would have a population that would have a much higher mutation of this stretch of protein coding. Okay, I guess they cured this guy by destroying all his immune system's cells, marrow cells, and then repopulating them. It's like a stem cell, a bone marrow transplant. And they use stem cells, oh, that's right, to replace that's what they did, of the HIV-infected patient. So we'll see what happens in terms of actually curing the disease. For now, it's mostly manageable, but not always. People still die of AIDS, of course. When it first showed up, it was a death sentence, always. Ebola. This is one of those diseases where the main host is not humans. It's actually probably a bat or something like that. Because it tends to kill people so quickly and puts them out of their misery that they have a hard time actually transmitting it. The only reason they transmitted it a lot here was part of the burial practices were handling and washing the body. Okay, and also West Africa has a much higher density of people than in the Congo, and so the transmission was a lot easier. And another thing that was interesting is that Ebola itself actually doesn't kill people. What it does is it causes an immune response that kind of goes into overdrive, and your own immune system actually kind of blows everything up. Okay. Anyway, prions are these proteins that are kind of strange. You can read about them. They're not caused by a virus or anything like that. What they do is they're proteins that are kind of misfolded, and they cause other proteins like themselves to misfold as well. So mad cow disease. Kuru, which is the one I told you about, the cannibals. Fatal familial insomnia. It makes it so that the person can never go to sleep. What a hell that would be. No. Okay. Immune system defenses. We have innate defenses that protect us from all kinds of different invaders, but they don't distinguish between certain pathogens and others. On our skin, we've got chemical barriers, and we've also got other bacteria that actually protect us from skin diseases or getting infected through our skin. We have some innate immunities, like barriers, physical and biochemical barriers, that provide the first line of defense. There's, what are they? There's chemicals that are released. Antihistamines are a good example, that gum up the works for where the virus is and kind of holds it in place. That's why you get your symptoms, you're being flooded with histamine, and that takes away some of the symptoms. But it's actually part of the defense. Then there's cellular immunity. In other words, we've got these bacteria, these phages, macrophage and white blood cells that come across something like a bacterium that it recognizes. It releases antibodies, and then other things swarm it and destroy it. Okay? Now, there's also something called adaptive immunity. The things that tell these cells what to go after and what antibodies to actually make are these different kinds of lymphocytes that one of them's a B cell. They basically are memory lymphocytes. They are encoded so that they remember all these different kinds of antigens or bacteria, proteins on bacteria. They recognize immediately, and they mount an immediate adaptive immune system. If they come across something that's new, it takes a while for the immune system to get going, but that's eventually, so the immune system then starts to change. You have new T cells that are better fit for the new invading pathogen. Without this, we wouldn't be able to survive. And in fact, it's our immune system that actually, in a sense, evolves throughout our lifetime that protects us from stuff that we've actually been infected with before. It gets exposed early on, let's say, when we're a kid, and then after that, it recognizes it. That's why vaccines actually work. So these are the different parts of the immune system. The innate immune system, inflammation and fever, tears in saliva, antimicrobial chemicals, mucus, skin and cilia, all that kind of, another bacteria, by the way. A lot of the times when we feel sick and we get a fever, we think, well, it's because of the pathogen. It's actually our own body raising the temperature. And by raising it a few degrees, it makes the pathogen, it's harder for the pathogen to live and reproduce and survive in you. So it actually, in many cases, it's not the pathogen that's making you get a fever, it's your own body to protect you, because it kills off a lot of pathogens. Okay, so this is the adaptive immunity. Produces these antibodies. These are antibody specific. They recognize certain proteins on the outside of a pathogen, whether it's a bacteria, a virus, or even, let's say, a toxin like rattlesnake venom. When it meets those things, all these antibodies glom onto it and immobilize it until a phagocyte, which is a big white blood cell, comes along and digests it. These molecules they target what's called non-self. There's a bit of a dark side to this that we'll get to, but it's called autoimmune diseases. These are these B and T cells. They're produced actually in the bone marrow, especially in the pelvic area. And they're stem cells. It turns out that they're multipotent stem cells because they have to turn into a bunch of different kinds of white blood cells, a whole slew of different kinds. And there's all parts of the different in the body that are responsible. So the thymus is where T lymphocytes mature. The bone marrow, where immature white blood cells are produced. The spleen, T and B lymphocytes respond to foreign invaders brought to the spleen in the blood. The bone marrow, B and T cells develop, and then what they do is, okay, they're the precursors to these B and T cells, and the B cells develop the bone, while the T cell precursors complete development in the thymus, and then these migrate into the lymph nodes, the spleen, and other tissue waiting to mount adaptive responses. These are kind of like the quarterbacks of the immune system, whereas the other cells are the ones that actually, let's say, destroy the bacteria. So, adaptive immunity, that's what it does. What we're doing with the vaccine is we're priming our adaptive immunity to recognize this as non-self. That means if you're infected with it, your immune system has already can produce millions and millions of antibodies to stop it in its tracks. If it has never been exposed to it before, the actual immunity, well, you don't have much. You have to take a while for the immune system to work, and by that time you can be overwhelmed. Okay, so it's a very rapid, what's called a memory response. Things that go into a vaccine. Now, vaccines are old. The first one that was used was actually, well, Edward Jenner got credit for it, for smallpox. He used a form of smallpox called cowpox, and it's related to smallpox. It makes you get blisters and stuff on your hands, and it's not very bad. A lot of milkmaids, young women would go down to milk the cows in the morning. A lot of them got cowpox, and they were immune to smallpox. So he started inoculating people. But this inoculation, it was actually recognized well before this. In fact, there was kind of a semi-inoculation, probably 1,000 years earlier in Turkey and the Middle East, where they would take someone with smallpox, they pierce some of the blisters and stuff, get a little bit on, and then inoculate another person with it. And a lot of the time, like about 95% of the time, those people got a mild form of smallpox, but it didn't kill them. About 5% of the time, they got full-blown smallpox and they got very sick or died. Okay, so it didn't work so well, but this was noticed. This is the basis for the whole vaccination thing that we see today. Depending on the kind of pathogen, it can be very long-lasting, for viruses especially, and usually protected against a foreign protein, whether it's the protein on a bacterium, on a virus, whatever, on a fungi, a protein that's a toxin. Let's say rattlesnake venom or something like that. Okay. Now, you might say, well, what about the flu vaccine? Well, influenza mutates a lot, and there's always a bunch of different strains, and so they have to make a new vaccine every year. That they hope they get the strain that causes the most problems. Okay, so that's what I mentioned. So when you have a vaccine, or in this case, a virus that causes the disease, and it gets mutations, this is called what's called antigenic drift. In other words, the antigen is the thing the immune system recognizes, and if it changes, and flu viruses change their protein codes a lot through mutation, then the old vaccine doesn't work on the new stuff. Oh, that's right. Viral genomes can actually swap parts of their genomes and incorporate both. And so you end up with a super strain. And like I mentioned with HIV, that's why the virus, you get these different strains building up, and some actually survive better in the spleen, others other place. So what you get is these two, let's say, viruses, H1N1, this is a flu, H2N2. They reassort, and now you've got a new strain with H2N1. Okay? By the way, bacteria, they don't have sex, right? But they exchange genomes. They do something called conjugation, where they have these little circular strands of DNA, are called plasmids, and they swap them. And that's one of the reasons that, antibiotic resistance happens so quickly. Because you can have one bacteria that is resistant and the other one isn't, and they switch and they're both resistant. And some of those bacteria are really unrelated. You can have a bacteria from as unrelated as I am to, let's say, a plant. Switch plasmas, and they're both resistant to the bacteria. So drift is mutation, and antigenic shift is actually mixing of the genomes. It's called recombinant. Kind of like when we talked about recombinant DNA. I already did that. Okay. Autoimmune diseases. Multiple sclerosis. A person's body is producing antibodies that target the myelin coating around neurons. And it destroys them. Well, you say, why is that happening? Why would the body go ahead and start targeting itself? It's a good question. It's not supposed to happen. Type 1 diabetes is one I also mentioned. Another one is rheumatoid arthritis. Lupus. There's a whole slew of them. Crohn's disease. It turns out, now when I mentioned earlier about when we get our gut bacteria when we're born, perhaps even a little earlier from our mothers, it's unclear. Our immune system is supposed to develop. And if you look at someone, well, if you looked at my gut bacteria compared to your gut bacteria, well, there'd all be differences between all of us. But I would almost guarantee that my gut bacteria are more diverse than yours. Okay? I grew up when parents didn't care what happened to their kids. They just wanted them out of the house. Okay? And not like today, you know, where everything out there is going to kill your kids, right? It's amazing how any kids in the past even survived, considering all the things that can actually kill kids. Somehow, I escaped. And one of the reasons I probably did is that when I ran around, I got really dirty. And like any kid, I was putting things in my mouth. I mean, the most disgusting things, right? Not even going to go there. Ugh. And I wouldn't get back to dinner until late at night. You know, I'd finally wander in, all bedraggled, and I'd eat, and the same day all over again. And I was getting exposed to all kinds of different things. This idea of an antiseptic environment was not the environment I grew up in. And it was thought, of course, previously that all these infectious diseases is because of these germs, and they're all bad. Of course, we know that they're not. Well, by not being exposed early in life, you end up with an immune system that doesn't develop properly a lot of times. And one of the things that seems to happen is that less developed immune systems start to target things that they shouldn't. In other words, autoimmune diseases. Okay? So, if any of you ever have kids, feed them dirt. And they'll be better for it. Now I'll get fired for sure. Is that it? Oh, yeah. Okay, good. Let's take a little break. I know I've been really pushing hard, but we don't have any more time together except for a final. And that's not fun time for us, is it? No, it's really miserable. You start to hate me, and I feel bad and guilty, and I got to go see a shrink, all that kind of stuff. So take 5 minutes and come back, and we'll get through as much as we can. Now, luckily, I'll put it up on Moodle. I finally got stuff cleared off of my iPad. So all this stuff will be up on Moodle, and you can take your leisure, because it's almost better to do it that way than listening to me, because you can stop and start and all that.